A woman drove 2 hours to a nursery last spring to buy a second tree of the exact variety she already had growing in her own yard. She paid $42 for it, plus the drive, plus the afternoon. She did not need to spend a cent of it. The tree she wanted was already standing on her own property, and she was carrying every single thing required to make a second one home with her the whole time. She simply did not know it. I am Hollis. I have kept this same ground since I was a boy behind my grandfather, and if there is one thing that still catches me off guard after all these years, it is how rarely anyone outside a working orchard ever hears about propagating from a tree they already own and trust. Nurseries sell trees. That is the whole business. A method that lets you walk away with a second tree for free from stock you already know is healthy and already know tastes right is not something that business has any reason to put in front of you. My grandfather never called it a trade secret. He would not have used those words. But he taught it to me the way a person teaches something they assume everybody's grandfather already taught them, quietly, in passing, while we were doing something else entirely. It took me years working around other growers to realize how few people had ever had that same conversation with anyone. Here is the mechanism worth understanding first. A tree does not need to touch soil to grow roots. Roots form wherever a stem is wounded down to the living green layer just under the bark, kept moist and kept in the dark. Cut a ring of bark away from a healthy branch. Pack that wound in damp moss, wrap it to hold moisture in, and that branch will often begin growing its own roots while it is still attached to the parent tree, feeding on the parent's own leaves the entire time. Once roots have formed, you cut that branch free below the new roots, and you have a second tree, genetically identical to the first. Same variety, same fruit, same flavor, grown from a stem instead of a seed. Growers have called this air layering for a very long time, and older growers still sometimes call it marcotting. A commercial nursery cannot run its business this way, even if it wanted to. It needs thousands of identical trees a year, produced fast and on a schedule, and grafting onto purchased rootstock does that at a scale a moss ball and a length of plastic never could. That is a completely reasonable choice for their business. It is a poor fit for a home grower who only ever wants one or two more of a tree already standing in the yard. The method that makes sense at their scale is simply the wrong tool at yours, and nobody in that chain has a reason to explain the difference to you. I want to be plain about where this fits and where it does not, because getting that wrong costs more than the $42 this saves. Apples and pears are almost always grafted onto a separate rootstock on purpose, because that rootstock controls the tree's mature size and gives it real resistance to certain root diseases the fruiting variety does not have on its own. Air layer an apple, and you get a tree growing on its own roots, without any of that rootstock's benefit, and apples in particular root poorly this way to begin with. This method earns its keep on citrus, figs, pomegranate, and several other fruiting shrubs and trees that root easily, and are usually grown on their own roots anyway. Know which category your tree falls into before you reach for a knife, and if you are not certain, that alone is worth asking a local grower about before you start. Let me walk through exactly how I do this on my own ground, step by step, because the order and the details are what separate a clone that takes from a wasted branch and a lost season. Number 1. Choosing the right branch. Pick wood from the current or previous growing season, roughly the thickness of a pencil up to about as thick as your thumb. Younger wood roots faster and more reliably than old, thick, woody limbs. Choose a branch out in good light rather than buried in shade, and choose one from a tree that is healthy and fruiting exactly the way you want the new tree to fruit. You are copying whatever you select, flaws included, so do not layer from the weakest branch on the tree, simply because it is convenient to reach. The cost here is nothing beyond a few minutes walking your own trees with a clear idea of what you actually want more of. Number 2. Making the wound. Using a clean, sharp blade, remove a ring of bark from around the branch, roughly 1 to 2 inches wide, cutting down through the bark and the thin green layer directly beneath it, all the way to the paler wood underneath. That green layer is what carries food down from the leaves to the rest of the branch. Removing a full ring of it stops that flow at the cut, and the branch responds by trying to grow new roots right at that exact spot to solve the problem itself. Scrape that exposed ring gently to be sure no green tissue survives across it, since any surviving strip will simply reconnect the flow and no roots will form. A cheap grafting knife or a good utility blade is all this takes. Well under $10 if you do not already own one. Number 3. Encouraging the root growth. Dust the wound lightly with a rooting hormone powder, widely sold at any garden center for a few dollars a bottle. Though established growers on easy rooting species like fig often skip it entirely and still get results. Pack a generous handful of damp sphagnum moss around the wounded ring, enough to fully surround it in a loose ball, roughly the size of a fist. The moss needs to stay damp the entire time, never soaking wet and never allowed to dry out completely. A moss ball that dries out even once during the weeks it takes to root can undo the whole attempt, so this is the one step worth checking on regularly rather than setting and forgetting. Number 4. Sealing it in. Wrap the moss ball tightly in clear plastic, an old bread bag or plastic wrap, both work fine, and tie it off snugly at both ends above and below the moss so no moisture escapes and no water gets in from rain. Clear plastic lets you see root development later without unwrapping anything, which matters more than it sounds like it would. This costs essentially nothing if you already have plastic wrap or bags in the house, which nearly everyone does. Number 5. Choosing the season. Do this during active growth. Once new leaves have fully hardened off in spring through the middle of summer, while the tree is actively pushing sap and has the energy available to grow new roots quickly. Attempt this on dormant wood in the cold months, and you will mostly just waste moss and time waiting on a branch that has no reason to root at that point in its year. If you are hearing this outside that window, the fix is simple. Choose your branch now, mark it, and come back to make the cut once real growth resumes. Number 6. Waiting and checking. Roots typically become visible through clear plastic within 6 to 12 weeks, species dependent, showing as pale threads pressing against the inside of the wrap. Check every couple of weeks by simply looking through the plastic rather than opening it, since disturbing a partially rooted layer sets it back and sometimes ends the attempt outright. Figs and citrus tend to be quick and forgiving. Some stone fruit species root more slowly and less reliably, and a portion of any batch simply will not take, no matter how carefully you follow every step. That is normal, not a sign you did something wrong. Number 7. Cutting it free. Once you can see a reasonable mass of roots filling a good portion of the moss ball, cut the branch free just below the new root system, leaving the roots and a short section of the moss attached. Do this with clean, sharp tools in one motion, rather than sawing back and forth, which tears young roots that have not yet toughened. You now own a second tree. It cost you a length of moss, a scrap of plastic, a few dollars of rooting powder if you used it, and the attention to check on it every couple of weeks. Number 8. Hardening it off before it goes in open ground. Pot the new tree in a container with good potting soil immediately after cutting it free, and keep it somewhere sheltered and slightly shaded for 2 to 3 weeks before it faces full sun and open weather. A newly rooted layer has a small root system relative to its top growth, and asking it to handle full exposure immediately before those new roots have had any time to establish inside real soil is the single most common way growers lose a layer after doing everything else correctly. Water it consistently through this period. A young root system this size has almost no reserve if it dries out even once. Number 9. Getting it into permanent ground. Keep the new tree in its container through its first full season, watching it settle and put on real growth before you ask it to handle open ground permanently. Move it into its final spot the following spring, once the roots have filled the pot and the tree is clearly growing on its own rather than simply surviving. Dig a hole roughly twice the width of the root ball, set it at the same depth it was sitting at in the container, and water it in well the day it goes in the ground. Mulch around the base once it is planted, keeping the mulch itself pulled back a couple of inches from the trunk so it never sits damp against the bark. A young tree planted this way, on its own roots, needs consistent water through its entire first season in the ground far more than an established tree does, since it has not yet built the deeper root system that lets an older tree coast through a dry stretch. Number 10. Keeping a simple record of what you actually did. I keep a page for every layer I take, same as I keep one for every graft. Species, the date the cut went in, the date roots first showed through the plastic, and a line on how that particular tree performed once it was in the ground and fruiting on its own. Some varieties on my own ground root in 6 weeks without fail. Others take closer to 12, and a few I no longer bother attempting at all because my own results told me plainly they were not worth the moss. That record is what turns a single season's result into something you can actually trust the next time, rather than a vague memory of whether it worked out. It also tells you, species by species, exactly which of your own trees are worth the 20 minutes, and which ones you are better off simply grafting or buying instead. Number 11. Deciding what to actually do with it. A single healthy parent tree can usually support 2 or 3 layers taken in the same season without meaningful stress. More on a large established tree. That is 2 or 3 new trees from stock you already trust in one growing season for close to nothing. Trade one with a neighbor for something growing on their ground that you do not have. Give one away. Or simply expand your own planting with a tree you already know performs exactly the way you want, rather than gambling $40 and a full season on an unfamiliar nursery tree that may or may not perform the way its tag promised. This is also worth knowing if you ever lose a favorite tree to storm damage or old age. A layer taken the season before is a living, genetically identical backup, sitting in a pot, ready to go into that same spot the following spring. Here is what you can actually do this week, regardless of what season you are hearing this in. Walk your own trees and identify 2 or 3 candidate branches on whichever tree you would most want a second copy of. Note their thickness and how much light they are getting. If it is the growing season right now, choose your tools, your moss and your plastic tonight and make your first cut this weekend. If it is not the growing season, mark those branches now with a strip of tape so you are not searching for the right wood again once real growth resumes. Check whether the tree you have in mind is actually a good candidate at all. Citrus, figs and pomegranate are excellent choices for a first attempt. Apples and pears, for the reasons I gave earlier, are usually better left to grafting onto proper rootstock, which is a different conversation I have covered elsewhere. If you already have moss and plastic wrap in the house, this costs you nothing tonight, beyond the time to walk your own ground and look closely at what you are already growing. Here is a simple routine built around the growing year, so this does not stay a one-time experiment. Every spring, once new growth has hardened off, walk your trees and choose 2 or 3 branches worth copying and get your first cuts made while the season still has months of active growth ahead of it. Through summer, check your wrapped layers every couple of weeks without disturbing them, and keep a close eye on watering for anything you have already potted up and hardened off earlier in the season. In autumn, move anything that rooted and has settled into its container, into its permanent spot in the ground, and mulch it well before the weather turns. Through winter, do nothing to your layers at all, beyond making sure mulch is holding and any stakes are still doing their job, and use the quiet season to look back at your written record and decide which species earned another attempt come spring. I put together a short written guide covering exactly which fruit species root reliably this way, rough timing by region, and a simple troubleshooting page for a layer that is not rooting after several weeks. It is linked below if you want the fuller reference while you try this yourself. That woman who drove 2 hours and paid $42 came back to see me a few months later, once I had shown her this same method on my own ground. She left with a length of moss, a roll of plastic wrap, and a plan for a branch on her own tree at home. She did not need the drive. She did not need the $42. She needed about 20 minutes and something she already owned the whole time. Most of what an orchard actually needs, it is already carrying somewhere on its own branches. The trick is knowing where to look. and knowing enough to ask before you reach for your wallet instead. I did not learn this from a class or a book. I learned it the same way my grandfather learned it, from somebody older, showing me on an actual branch, on actual ground, because that is simply how this particular piece of knowledge has always travelled. It never needed a nursery catalogue or a price tag. It only ever needed one grower willing to show another exactly where to cut. So this week, walk your own trees, pick the branch you would most want a second copy of, and make that first cut before the season moves past you again. 20 minutes now is the whole difference between driving 2 hours for a tree you already had and simply growing it yourself.